start for booking your place on those programs. They do get booked up very quickly because they're very good and very popular. Okay, so without further ado, I will now introduce Geoff Pick, OBE, who really doesn't need much introduction from me because this is the 5th talk which he has kindly given to Dulwich. I know that he's also now a speaker for the London region, and he's also allowed us to use his premises in the past, and many of you will know him through looking at your family history at the London Metropolitan Archives. So today Geoff is going to talk about John Keats and about the house in Hampstead that he occupied from 1818 to 1820. And my understanding is that Geoff was the curator there who oversaw the renovation of that beautiful property. So Geoff, can I hand this over to you now?
Thank you very much, Angela. Yes, it's lovely to speak to you all again, see you all again. If I've done 5, I think I should probably not outstay my welcome. However, John Keats is something we haven't talked about, I haven't talked about before. What I'm going to do today is rather like I did on the last time I spoke to you all about the School Board for London, which is that I have a PowerPoint of images and I'll talk through those images and give you a bit more of the story of John Keats and Keats House in Hampstead. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen and get to that PowerPoint. So if you bear with me, I will do this, and I'll now set that up as a slideshow. And so hopefully you should see a full screen now with those wonderful words, "Oh poet, come you haunting here at the top of the first slide. What I said the last time I spoke is I'm more than happy to take any questions at the end. So either put them in the chat or somebody from the U3A group will moderate and make sure I answer the questions I haven't seen. I did have a quick look at the subtitles when Neil and I were first on the call, and somehow I said mangoes when I didn't think I'd said mangoes. So you may want to try and listen to me rather than read the subtitles, but we'll wait and see. Anyway, the first thing I'd better say is quite wise the director of an archive speaking to you about Keats House. And it's quite simple, really. Up to the 1990s, Keats House, for which you can see a picture in the on the screen in front of you, was run by the London Borough of Camden. But at that point, it was running into grave financial difficulties in trying to look after the house. And because a few years before, the City of London Corporation, for whom I work and for who runs LMA, had already taken over the management of Hampstead Heath, they agreed in about 1997 to also take over the running of Keats House in Hampstead. So that's when the city took it over. But after about a couple of years, they weren't sure which bit of the city to give it to manage. It had come as a library, but although it has a lot of books and manuscripts, it isn't really a library in the lending library sense of the word. And so eventually they gave it to LMA to help manage, because in the words of our previous town clerk, chief executive, we kind of do history and culture. Well, we do in a way, but it was a rather large learning curve for us to suddenly take over managing a historic house. However, we did this, and for about 10 years, from about 2002 to about 2012, 2013, I was the senior person responsible for managing Keats House. And during that time, we had the amazing opportunity to completely renovate the house with a major grant from the then Heritage Lottery Fund. So a lot of what I'm going to do today is to talk about this house in Hampstead. Hopefully, for those of you who haven't been or haven't been a while, a taster for when it does reopen once the lockdown is finished, to go and visit it, because it's an absolutely wonderful place to visit. Fantastic stuff goes on there, events, talks, but just going round and seeing this house where John Keats lived is really, really special. And I have to say, from broadly the Dulwich area, it's very straightforward to get to on Thameslink. So bear that in mind if you feel like going up sometime. So that's really, if you like, the reason why I can speak to you about Keats House today. And just to give you a couple of things about the house before I talk to you a little bit more about John Keats and his life and his poetry. The first is, just so you know what I'm going to be talking about, this is Keats' house. But when Keats was there, that little extension, the single-story extension on the left with the chimney piece, was not there in Keats's day. So remove that from what you're thinking about. The other thing about Keats House is that it looks like a detached single property, and it was built in 1815 to look that way, but in fact, it was a semi-detached property. That front door was not John Keats's front door. That front door was to the right-hand side of the house, the window above it, and the rooms with the windows on the right as you look. John Keats would have had to have gone in round the side where that extension is and have gone in to the rooms on the left-hand side of the property. So I'm going to say more about this in a while, but it just gives you a flavour of what we're talking about and the house as it was when John Keats lived there. I should also say, and picking up what Angela said about the London region, is that some of you are connected with many other sort of Venn diagram groups in this area, in the Dulwich District area. And I'd like to let you know that I will be speaking on behalf of the London region of U3A in March, I think, or February, I can't remember the date. Now that is also going to be on John Keats, but that's much more going to focus on his poetry. I've seen that Liz Day's on the call, and Liz spoke to me earlier, late last year, and we're going to do a talk then when there are going to be poetry readings, not by me, but some of you who are involved in poetry readings in Dulwich District, but I'm going to be doing a bit of an overview of John Keats and also the background to some of his poems. So a bit of a different approach. So don't feel if you've seen this and you'd like to learn a bit more about John Keats, there's more opportunity there. There's also a talk I'm giving to the St Barnabas Men's Group, which is not just for men in Dulwich, in St Barnabas area, but is another talk. And again, I'm going to be giving a slightly different slant on that, on John Keats. There will be things that will be the same, but hopefully, if you happen to tune in to all three, you'll either catch me out in my mistakes or you'll be able to hear a little bit different, some other part of John Keats' story. Because if you take his life, his poetry, his house, his letters, there's a huge amount to say upon this person. And I think you'd find interest in all three talks. But this one is about John Keats, Hampstead, and eventually a Nightingale. So first of all, I'm going to kick off by hopefully going to my second slide, which is to give you a little bit of a background on who was John Keats. All of these are images of John Keats, either made at the time or made slightly after his death. And all, as you can see, are slightly different. In fact, after he died, many people saw paintings and death masks, and all his friends and family argued about which was the most like John Keats likeness. And I'm not sure we'll ever get to the bottom of that, but this was John Keats. John Keats, who died on the 23rd of February, 1821. And so in a month's time, we will celebrate, and I think celebrate is the right word, the bicentenary of the end of this life that was amazing. He only lived for 26 years, roughly, but his contribution to English poetry, English culture, English life has been huge. And that's a little what I'd like to take you through today. But I think the key thing that I learned coming to look after Keats's house is Who was he? If you read some books, you might imagine he's a rather Lawrence Llewellyn Bowen kind of figure, sitting around all day in a moping stance with long white sleeves, kind of idly writing the odd poem or two, a bit Byronic. But actually, hopefully, if you don't know a lot about John Keats, and some of you may know much more than I do, you get a feeling for John Keats, who was the man who was none of those pictures. He was actually about 5'1" tall. He liked fighting at school. He liked cricket, which we'll get into soon, but he wasn't the kind of person that sometimes we hear about. He wasn't as romantic with a capital R or a small r as sometimes he's pictured. What I'm going to do now is run through a little bit of his life and draw out a few of the points that I think I found quite interesting when I started to learn much more about him when I was looking after the house. So, he was born in 1795. He was actually born in the City of London, very close to what is now Moorgate Station, at the Swan and Hoop Inn. His dad ran the livery stables there. He was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He was born to a working family and lived in that working livery stables inn for a number of his early years. Mother was Thomas, his dad was Francis, and he was born, as far as we know, on the 31st of October. So a really great day to remember. When everyone else was out celebrating Halloween, we were celebrating John Keats' birthday in his house, much to the amazement of those young children who knocked on our door in Hampstead with trick-or-treating at that time. However, very shortly after he was born, his brother George was born. George features strongly in his life, partly because he went to live in America and John Keats wrote frequently to him and indeed supported him financially. His younger brother Tom, born in 1799, who he nursed in Tom's later life through tuberculosis. His brother Edward, who was born in 1801 but very sadly died the following year. And almost the love of his life beyond Fanny Brawn, who will come to meet later on, but Fanny Keats, his sister, for whom he kept up another long, loving, written relationship you can see in his letters throughout their lives. So he had an early childhood in the City of London, but in 1803, he went to John Clarke's school in Enfield. Now this, in some ways, was a turning point for John Keats in his life. John Clarke's school was a very, very progressive school. Nicholas Rowe, in his fairly recent biography, says it was one of the most progressive schools in the country at the time. It was very influenced by progressive ideas, influenced by the Baptist movement, influenced by the Free Church movement, those people who supported the early movement in the French Revolution. And so he went to a school that hugely informed how he developed in his adult life. He learned a lot about not just poetry, the classics, but all the things you would learn at a modern school at those times. And he had a very, very nice early introduction to that school life. But very sadly, his life took a turn downwards. And I think this is where you start to learn more about John Keats, the person. When he was only 8, his father died in a riding accident. In fact, he'd been coming back from Enfield to his home in the city on his horse, and he fell, hit his head on the curb, and died very quickly. We know this because we have the coroner's file for his father's death in the city's archives. Another one of those links with what we'd have at LMA, which have informed, how we can tell his story, how we understand his story. His mother his mother married again within 2 months of his father dying, and left the children with their grandparents. She and her new husband, William, who was much younger than her, took over the running of the livery stables, but the children were moved on to live with their grandparents. We don't exactly know why, but it was a major traumatic year in John Keats's life. As far as we know, John and his brothers and sisters were happy with his grandparents, John and Alice Jennings, in Edmonton, so not very far away from the school in Enfield. But sadly, his grandfather died in 1805, and eventually his mother split up from her husband. They had no success in running the livery stables after they took over from Thomas Keats. But very sadly, she died after she returned to looking after the children. And part of that early family life were a large number of lawsuits about inheritance. And this is something that dogged Keats all his life. There were always money problems in the family. There was always money tied up in chancery lawsuits between members of the family, whether it was John Jennings's will or Thomas Keats's estates, not helped by John Keats's mother, who was very litigious within those times. But this involved many people in the family and did not help John Keats as the elder brother, who had to, in some ways, sometimes look after his brothers and sisters by trying to support them financially as well. And as you'll see through the rest of his life, while he lived in Hampstead, he was never financially secure. Eventually, after leaving school, he started to take a medical direction in his career. 1811, he was apprenticed to Thomas Hammond, surgeon Edmonton, known by the family. But by 1814, so we're talking 1819 years old, he starts to write some of the poetry that starts to survive. His earliest poem about Spencer, survives from that period. But then his grandmother Alice Jennings dies, and Richard Abbey becomes his guardian, his as well as the other children. And Richard Abbey, again, another part of the story that we could explore at other times, held very firm views that basically, and this is not uncommon, that John Keats needed a proper career and that poetry was not a proper career. If we move on to the second slide on his life, he begins studies after his work with his GP. He actually starts work at Guy's and becomes a dresser there. A dresser was broadly an apprentice surgeon, worked with famous surgeons of the day, and it's why you'll find a statue of John Keats at Guy's and other ways in which he's remembered there. But he continues to write poetry, and gradually poetry takes over his life. But in 1816, he does pass his medical examinations and is licensed by the Society of Apothecaries. Now, apothecaries, you tend to think of as Shakespearean apothecaries. You tend to think of them as possibly quacks, giving Romeo a drug. But actually, by the 19th century, apothecaries were very, very broadly, and I apologise to those of you in the medical profession, they were broadly becoming the GPs of their day. They were not that, but broadly the more general practice medical practitioners compared to the surgeons in hospitals. So he was very, very highly thought of, and he became a professional medic, but he did not take up that career. From then on, he starts to write poetry in a much more disciplined and a much more professional way. By this time, he's becoming well known within the literary circle within London, within the people who knew and talked about poetry. He eventually did get to know Wordsworth and Coleridge and other people within that circle. So he starts to develop, if you like, his poetic voice. He writes one of his first most well-known poems on first looking into Chapman's Homer. Eventually, in 1817, he moves into Hampstead. Wellwalk is not very far from Keats Grove, where he eventually lived, where Keats' house is, but he often lived a peripatetic life. He was never really settled anywhere, even when he was living at Keats' house. And he certainly spent several times on the Isle of Wight. It's certainly when he started to write one of his longest, most well-known poems, Endymion, which he eventually published in 1818. But sadly, the reviews for that were not very positive. Some of them picked on John Keats because he wasn't wealthy and academic like Wordsworth or Coleridge. He'd had an educated childhood, but he did not come from a wealthy background. He came from a working class background. He had a very good education, but not compared to others. He was described as a Cockney poet in very much of a put down, and it very much did affect him, perhaps not in the way that he's later seen. And I think one of the aspects of John Keats's life is that we see it in retrospect from his death. He died as a young man, aged 26, 25, 26. You know, he was ill with tuberculosis. He does write about death and life in his poetry, but he was a doctor, he medical person, he knew about those things. And I think there's a danger that we put that back into Keats's early life. He wasn't ill for most of his life. He was alive and healthy and vigorous. He climbed Ben Nevis. He went for long walking tours in the Lake District. He did a huge amount of that kind of almost romantic poet standard exercise. You always remember Wordsworth and Coleridge tramping miles across the fells. Keats did that as well. But very sadly, that poetry, those reviews did affect him, but he continued to write poetry. Great friends with Charles Brown. It becomes really significant in his life later on. And in 1818, he meets Fanny Brawne for the first time. Fanny Brawne, same first name as his sister. You can get confused about them, certainly the way some people write. Fanny Brawne, who becomes the person he becomes engaged to and really central to his life. But Fanny Brawne and Charles Brown almost become the polar opposites of his life. They both wish to protect John Keats, and both are almost opposite to each other. Very sadly, I mentioned his younger brother Tom. He nurses Tom, who also got tuberculosis, until Tom's death on the 1st of December, which then becomes another turning point in his life. He moves into the place that we know now as Keats House, then known as Wentworth Place, because Charles Brown owned half of Keats House. And Charles Brown knew him already and was a friend, and basically said, you need to move out of that place where your brother's just died. I've got a spare room. You can come and stay with me. And that was it. That was the story. Sometimes one tends to think that John Keats lived in Hampstead, a very, very upmarket, expensive place to live in London. It was in 1818, as it is today. He must have been a wealthy man, but he wasn't. He was literally paying a small amount of money to Charles Brown, but living in his friend's spare room. So something else that I think is interesting to explore. But one of the reasons why Keats House is so important in his life, and sometimes people said, well, why he only lived there off and on for 2 years out of 26 years. Why is it that important? It's while he was living at Keats House that he wrote some of his most well-known and most important poetry, not just because he was living in that house, but that was his most creative period. As you see, and you look at that slide, he writes the Eve of St. Agnes. He writes the La Belle Dame, Ode to a Nightingale, the ones that he's most well known for, if you had to name his top 5, his top 10. But he still can't stay there every day, because Charles Brown was not a very successful businessman and let Keats House, his half of it, for paying guests during the summer. So every once in a while, Brown and Keats had to move out, go on a walking tour, live somewhere else, and then come back when the tenants had moved out. It's also the case Fanny Brawne moved in next door, but we'll come to that a bit later on. So in 1819, it's his annus mirabilis, if you like. It's his big year. He goes back to the Isle of Wight, and he stays in Winchester, famously writes about it, and writes To Autumn. It's one of those few times when we know exactly when he wrote the poem, because that's where he says in one of his letters, But just before we move to our final slide, I just wanted to say a couple of quotes from his letters, and I would recommend his letters to you wholeheartedly. If you've never read any of Keats's letters, they give a fascinating side to his life and his interests that give you another entrance into who he was. But just a couple of things that he was doing in 1819, one of which refers to that house where he lived was divided into two. The first is, now this is part of a huge letter, long letter, he wrote over a couple of months to his brother who was in America. So he stops and starts it, and right towards the end, when we get into about January, February 1819, he says, I shall immediately, as I send this off, begin my journal, when some days shall write no more than 10 lines, and others 10 times as much. Mrs. Dilke, who was living on the other half of the house, is knocking on the wall to say that tea is ready. I will tell you what sort of tea it is, and then bid you goodbye. And then he comes back to the letter the day afterwards. This is Monday morning. Nothing particular happened yesterday evening, except that just when the tray came up, Mrs. Dilke and I had a battle with celery stalks. She sends her love to you. I just imagine Mrs. Dilke and John Keats fighting with celery stalks in Keats' house. Again, another different vision that I don't think you normally pick up if you read Ode to a Nightingale or La Belle Dame. And then later on in that year, it was clearly nice enough to go out onto Hampstead Heath. And he obviously goes out with Charles Brown. Because he says this in a letter, another letter to George Keats. Yesterday, I got a black eye. The first time I took a cricket bat. Brown, who was always one's friend in a disaster, applied a leech to the eyelid. And there is no inflammation this morning, though the ball hit me directly on the sight. It was a white ball. Interesting. I don't think they were playing at night, by the way, those of you who like limited overs cricket. I'm glad it was not a clout. This is the second black eye I've had since leaving school. During all my school days, I never had one at all. So again, he wasn't always writing poetry. However, he did continue to write poetry, but very sadly, 1820, he had his first lung hemorrhage. And because he was medically trained, he knew exactly what he had. He'd actually been into London. He couldn't afford to sit on the inside of the coach bringing him home. He sat on the outside. He did not have a coat on. It was bad weather, pouring with rain. He caught a chill, but this brought on TB. Very sadly, he had to move out while he was ill to Kentish Town because Charles Brown was once again letting his house. But he did continue to write. He wrote Lamia, or he finished off Lamia, and a second set of poems were published. He returns to Wentworth Place in the summer, but by then he's very ill, and his friends and family persuade him to go to Italy to recover his health, to stay in a warmer climate. He knew almost certainly he was not coming back. He was medically trained. He had seen his brother died of tuberculosis. He'd seen his mother die of tuberculosis. He knew what was there, but he went with his friends. He went for Italy. He went with a very good friend of his, Joseph Seven, who is very important in his life, and actually after he died. He reached Naples on the 21st of October. But what a coincidence of where we are today. He had to quarantine for 10 days because in London, there'd been an outbreak of typhus and the Naples authorities said he could not land, he could not disembark for 10 days after he'd arrived. But eventually he did, and they moved to Rome and famously went to stay on the Spanish Steps in the house that is still open to the public to his memory. But his TB got no better. In fact, it got worse. And he died with Joseph Seven on the 23rd of February in 1821. And a few days later was buried by Joseph Seven in the Protestant cemetery in Rome, where you can see his grave today and where you can see his gravestone which famously says, one whose name is writ on water, one whose name will be forgotten. But his name wasn't forgotten. There's another story about Keats's popularity and how he did become so well known as he is today. But that did not happen instantaneously. It was probably only by about 1850, 25 years later, that actually he became as well known as he is today. Really only when his first biography was written, when the pre-Raphaelites adopted him as one of their spiritual fathers, did he really become famous. But that's another story. We're now going to move on a little bit to a bit more of the story of this amazing house where he lived, what it was and how we actually tried to look after it, and what we did and what we didn't do. There you are. You can see the front of it. As I say, remember, it was always divided into two. This is the back of it. Again, the left-hand extension, right-hand extension was not there. The houses on the right were certainly not there. The veranda was probably there, but we can't say for certain. But the house was, and even though very little inside the house were things that were owned by John Keats, because as I said, he didn't own the house. He died in Italy. He did not die wealthy. He did not die famous. When Byron died, he was a grade 1 A-list celebrity, and everybody kept the thing they were given by Byron. This is the inkpot he had. This is that. Very little survived. There are some things, but very little survived of John Keats from that period. These two images are of Charles Brown. I mentioned how he was really important in giving Keats a room to live, but he was also very protective of John Keats. He wanted him to be a poet. Although he had to ask him to leave the house from time to time because of financial issues, he did want him to become a poet. And this is where his great dislike of Fanny Brawne came in, because he believed that Fanny Brawne was a bad influence on John Keats because he was so in love with her that he couldn't write poetry. He did not like Fanny Brawne because that. And Fanny Brawne suffered because of that. And there was this tension and antagonism for certainly those last couple of years of John Keats's life. One of the other people very important in John Keats's life, but actually somebody who came to Keats's house later on. But first of all, this is the front parlour. This is the room where John Keats would have lived and stayed. But when you visit the house, it was basically a 2 up, 2 down with a basement kitchen. And this was the front room. And just to remember, this is also the house before it was restored. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the house was restored. But this is just an image of how it was last restored before I got involved in it. And this is when it was restored in the 1970s. But this is the other person, not important in Keats's life, but important in the life of Keats's house. Eliza Chester bought this detached property that was in 2 halves in about 1839, 1840. And she did what everybody does nowadays. She knocked it into one and built an extension. And she built that wing on the side of the house, which is now called the Chester Room, in her memory. And she knocked through and had a very nice retirement house, shall we say. Now, Eliza Chester was brought up in Windsor. She was a genuine actress. She performed at Drury Lane. She performed in some of the major plays of the day. And this I have to stress because she was most well known as one of George IV's mistresses. In fact, there are many Crookshank and other cartoons of the day lampooning Eliza Chester, and she became known as Prinny's last fling. She was one of his last mistresses. She actually had a court position. She was known as the King's Reader. If the king was unable to get to sleep, he summoned the King's Reader who would read to him before bedtime. The rest of the story I leave to your imagination. But Eliza Chester, after George IV died, retired from public life and bought a very nice house in Hampstead, but bought the house broadly as you see it today. This is a portrait of Eliza as a young woman, and that is actually in one view in the house today. And this is the room as it was in the early 2000s. And as you will see how we have different views of changing it. The picture on the right is also Eliza Chester as Lady Teazle. And one thing I'd like you to do is remember the mirror. Remember the mirror at the end of the room. Right, moving on. This is the Chester room from the other end. And this is one of the few bits of documentary evidence we have of John Keats, of the Keats house. This was a painting of John Keats done by his friend Joseph Severn shortly after he died, but a few years afterwards. And this was done because this was meant to be one of John Keats's favourite ways of reading. 2 chairs, arm on one, cross legs, reading. That's why Joseph Severn painted. But for us, he painted it in the back parlour. You've seen the front parlour. This is the back parlour. And this was given by Charles Brown to John Keats to use as his study. Now, and it's one of the few bits of evidence. You can see me in, I'm using inverted commas, which you probably can't see around that, because it was painted about John Keats. It was painted several years afterwards, after Keats had lived in the house. And it's about John Keats, not about the carpet. However, there is a carpet there. So we did look at that to see how we might paint the carpet. Just to give you an idea, this is a rather romantic view. You notice the rather Italianate scene outside the back garden. We don't really believe it looked like that. However, it's a nice view, but bear that in mind as well. The other thing I should say, final thing, the image above John Keats on the wall is a print of William Shakespeare. John Keats loved and adored John Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, one of his major influences. And wherever he moved, when he went to the Isle of Wight, when he lived in Well Walk, he took a print of William Shakespeare with him and put it up there as a kind of, this is the person who most inspires me. Moving quickly on, John Keats. We got a major grant from the National Lottery Fund to restore Keats House and to open it up to the public. So we stuck scaffolding around it because the house was built in 1815 as a speculative build. It was not meant to be around 200 years later. But fortunately for the house, but unfortunately for everybody who has to look after it, it needs restoration every 10 years, every 20 years, and this was the time it needs restoration. When Andrew Motion was writing his biography of John Keats there, he said that when it rained, you could see the rain coming in through the walls, never mind the windows. So it's a very leaky house. It'll never be perfect, but we got some fantastic money from the lottery with city money as well. And I learned a lot more about how you look after 19th century houses than I ever knew before we started. So we ripped it apart. We took the floorboards up. We put wiring in. We put more central heating in. But that actually is one of the interesting questions. How do you restore Keats House? Do you bulldoze that wing put up by Eliza Chester? Because it wasn't original when Keats was there, but that's the only room you can have poetry readings in. Every room is tiny. Do you turn it into a semi-detached house, if you like, as it was in Keats' day? But it wasn't that 5 years, 10 years after he died. Do you have central heating in? Staff have to work there. So all these questions you have to find, I feel, you have to find a compromise around. They're fascinating stories, fascinating questions, and I think every time I visit a historic house nowadays, it makes me think not just about the story, but how I'm being told the story and what is, in inverted commas, real and what is made up. We have very little documentary evidence for what the house looked like. I'd love to find John Keats's diary that says, I walked into my sitting room and the wallpaper was floral with this and the carpet was X, Y, and Z. But sadly, he didn't. No photography, We have to rely on about one painting and a couple of Keats quotes and what we found when we did the research, because we got painting experts in, and just like you saw on the exterior of the house, we got somebody in to look at what was the original painting colour for the house on the outside in Keats's day. And you'll be unsurprised to know it was magnolia. So we painted a magnolia. However, the inside we did slightly differently, but this is what we had to do. We took it apart. This is the Chester room. We've got lots of paintings of this. This is the Chester room with the wallpaper down. And when we took the wallpaper down, we looked to see what was behind it, to see if we could find any evidence of John Keats scratching his name on the wallpaper. Sadly, no. We found some fascinating wallpaper from the 1870s that was sanitary wallpaper in an 1870s toilet, which was wallpaper you could wash down. Who knew? However, we don't really make much of that nowadays. But we restored the room, and this is how we started to restore the Chester room. There's a lot I could talk about, and I could answer questions about how we made those design decisions. But the key thing about the Chester room, it wasn't a Georgian building, it was a Victorian building room. And so the wallpaper we used was Victorian wallpaper, not Georgian wallpaper. Now we could have done it like the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, but we didn't know that that's the way Eliza Chester designed it, so we took a slightly more conservative view. But this is what we did. We had the builders in. In fact, this is our city surveyor telling the workmen they've got to do something probably they didn't want to do. And we had real gold leaf. One of the things we're able to do, we bought gold leaf from one of the few firms that still make it in Florence. And there is the gold leaf being applied. Brilliant. I just love that. And this is Eliza Chester being brought back, because what we obviously had to do, take everything out of the house, keep it in the archive or in various other places, and then bring it back, make sure we didn't lose anything. And here she is going back on the wall in pride of place. And this is what broadly it looks like nowadays. It's a Victorian room. It might be a room that Eliza Chester recognised. Certainly the carpet and the walls are in the same design that you could have found in Eliza Chester's day. The swag festoons over the windows are the kind of thing you could have found. And Eliza Chester was very well-to-do, pretty wealthy, so that's the kind of way we clothed that room. If somebody else took a different view in 30 years' time, that's great. What we've done is kept all the evidence about what we've done to give you a flavour. This is Keats's study. As you'll see, the carpet is fairly similar to Keats's day. We have a print of William Shakespeare on the wall, so it gives you a flavour of what it was like. And again, we have two chairs that were actually made in the 1920s to give a flavour of that John Keats, how he would have sat there and read his books in that very room. And that's the thing about the house. John Keats was in that very room. He would have looked out of that very window. And as far as we understand it, the very glass in the very window. So that's why I think the house, while it doesn't have many of the things that Keats owned, it does have that sense of place that poet did live there. That poet haunted there. That poor poet haunted that place. Now, this is my bit of egotism. I do apologise. This was a picture taken when we reopened the house in 2009. And when we had some of the press around, they said, we want somebody in the picture, Geoff. So I had to sit there looking like I knew what Keats's poetry was like. But this is that front parlour. And this is where Keats famously sat when he was ill. And again, it's one of those few occasions when we know where Keats was at a particular moment. So in a letter he wrote to his sister, Fanny, on the 8th of February, 1820, so only 5 days after had his first lung hemorrhage, this is what he says. I have a very pleasant room for a sick person. A sofa bed is made up for me in the front parlour, the room you're looking at, which looks out on the grass plot as you remember, Mrs. Dilks does. Mrs. Dilks living in the other half of the house, because despite the fact that these were two semi-detached houses, they shared one garden. How much more comfortable than a dull room upstairs where one gets tired of the pattern of the bed curtains. We think his bed curtains were patterned. So when we got new bed curtains, we had patterned bed curtains. We also know there were two bedrooms upstairs. The bigger one was Charles Brown's, the smaller one was John Keats. And that's all we know. Besides, I see all that passes. For instance, now, this morning, if I'd been in my own room, I should not have seen the coals brought in. The rest of that letter describes who he sees pottering around up and down a street in Hampstead in 1820. Lovely letter, but gives you a flavour of what the area felt like at the time. So that's that room. And this is Fanny Brawn. This is a painting of Fanny about 1831, slightly after time she knew John Keats. She was younger than John Keats, about 2-3 years. But the thing about the house is we have much more about Fanny Brawn than we do of John Keats, because Fanny lived to much later. She lived into the 1850s. Eventually, after about 4 or 5 years of mourning, she did marry. She actually went to live on the continent. But by the time she was older, John Keats was famous, and her relationship was famous with him, and she had things about John Keats. She was as protective of him, or as Charles Brown was, in many different ways, and to be honest, was not the drag on his creativity that Charles Brown thought he was. But that's my view. So we have a wonderful painting to see what Fanny Brawn looked like. We also have a letter that she wrote to John Keats when she was living in one half of the house and he was living in the other half. She was literally the girl next door, because she moved into the other half of the property when John Keats was living there with her mum and her younger sisters. And this letter came up for auction in 2011, one of the few John Keats letters in private hands. And again, with lottery funding, we were able to purchase it. And the sense of place is amazing, because that letter was taken out of one door in one side of the property and put through the letterbox in the other side from John Keats in about February, March 1820, so just after he wrote that other letter to his sister. And you probably can't see it. You can see me as well. This is the letter. Actually, it's a repro, but this, I'll show you when we come back on screen. It's a tiny letter, but it's so moving. He's basically saying, I'm too ill to see you today, but I kiss the ring you gave me and I will see you soon. It's a wonderful letter. Anyway, and it ends, ever yours affectionately, my dearest, JK. And this is the other amazing coincidence when we were looking after the house. The very year we reopened the house, the one and only film of John Keats that's probably ever been made, certainly a full-length Hollywood blockbuster, was launched. Hopefully you've all seen it. I'm sure you're all Keats fans. But Bright Star with, I'm afraid we think of him as Paddington nowadays, but Ben Whishaw and Abbie Cornish. Ben Whishaw as John Keats, Abbie Cornish as Fanny Brawn, was released just as we reopened. Talk about a godsend for publicity and driving footfall to the house. I could not have, planned it better. The film, if you haven't seen the film, do watch it after you've been to the house. The film was not filmed at Keats' house because basically Keats' house is too small to film, and besides, it's built up around it now. It's not as empty as it was in Keats's day. But we were able to work with the people who produced the film. We were able to borrow some costumes from the film, which was brilliant at the time. They had some of the press interviews there. And yes, I did meet Ben Whishaw. So my one claim to fame, which was brilliant. So I shook the hand of Ben Wishaw. And for a couple of my staff who wanted to have their photo taken, he was a gentleman, as you might expect. He was lovely, had his picture taken. And we did have the post-premiere party at Keat's house. So all the great and the good came up to Keat's house for a party after the event. And that's a whole other story. But I just stood in the background and watched it all happen. Sadly, no more great and the good, but that was really good too. Wonderful, good film. Although I'd have to say, a friend of mine did say it was like watching paint dry. So I think horses for courses. If you love John Keats, I think it's a great story. But we have John Keats's. We have the engagement ring that John Keats gave Fanny Brougham. There is some debate amongst some people as to whether they were actually engaged, but they were. I think there's no doubt about it. And in fact, this is the other really, really interesting thing about the relationship. This was a copy of Shakespeare's poems that John Keats owned, into which he wrote the poem Bright Star, became the name of the film. This was dedicated to Fanny Brougham. This is in his handwriting. We hold this in the Keats collections. It is often on display, as the letter is, not all the time, to protect it from decay, but he gave this to her before he left, because he gave many of his possessions away when he left for Italy. He knew he wasn't coming back, but he gave presents, and this is from him to her. It's a wonderful connection between the two. And now I'm going to come on to her in a minute, just a few things about how we use the house, because the lottery quite likely do not give us money just to, if you like, paint a beautiful doll's house, to restore it, put lime watch on the outside. I have wonderful stories about wallpaper and paint and what have you, but we needed to do something with it, and we did. And I have to say, she's now retired, well, more stuff, but an amazing person who was on our education team, who is a poet in her own right. But she was instrumental on bringing poetry to Keats' house, because, of course, one of the things we ought to develop is not the house as a focus for John Keats's poetry, amazing as it is, but for poetry of all kinds, all shapes and sizes, from the start of poetry to the present day. And we can do that. And John Keats would have loved that idea, I'm sure, because he loved poetry. He loved poets. And there are famous phrases, quotes from him about the importance of poetry. So we were able to bring amazing people there. It wasn't down to me, it was down to my colleagues. But remember the mirror. I'm sure, I'm not captioning this, you can play the game. I'm sure you know her. Bernardine Evaristo won the Booker Prize last year, came and did a creative writing class at Keats' house, because that's what the house does now. I'm not responsible for it, but it does amazing things. We had a series of people who became poets in residence. Every year, a poet would come and be a poet in residence for a while. And one of our amazing poets, Benjamin Zephaniah, my colleague had to chase him, I think literally about 2 or 3 years before he came, in front of the mirror, on that seat in the front parlour. Absolutely amazing. A force of nature, brilliant, writing classes for kids. Yeah, if you ever have a chance to see him read poetry, talk about poetry, amazing. And if you can recognise the man with the blue shirt, you might have got the other two. This one's slightly harder for my quiz. I'm not asking you to say anything, but if you do know this man is John Headley. Again, an amazing poet, very, very different from the others, but loved coming to John Keats. This is him doing poetry and dancing, a very different kind of poet, but an amazing poet. And great fun, again, in front of the mirror. Another reason why we didn't knock down the Chester room, because of that would have been cutting off our nose to spite our face, because it's the only room where you can have people to read poetry. And what would you believe, the maximum number of people the fire service say you can have in the room sat down is 42. Douglas Adams would have been proud. Anyway, I'm coming towards the end of this talk, but I just wanted to say a few things about plum trees and nightingales. This is a plum tree. This is an important tree, but it's not the plum tree John Keats sat under, because plum trees don't live for 200 years. Much as people visit the house and do say, is it the tree that John Keats sat under? It's a bit young. This is one we planted in 2009. But plum trees are important. And I just want to read to you one little bit about why plum trees are important in Keats's life. If you see the film Bright Star, John Keats actually goes up and sits in the top of a plum tree. I'm afraid he couldn't do that with this one. But this is what Charles Brown writes about a particular incident. It's quite a famous incident, but nevertheless worth reading out this paragraph. In the spring of 1819, a nightingale had built her nest near my house. Keats felt a tranquil and continual joy in her song. And one morning he took a chair from the breakfast table to the grass plot under a plum tree, where he sat for 2 or 3 hours. When he came into the house, I perceived he had some scraps of paper in his hand, and these he was quietly thrusting behind the books. On inquiry, I found these scraps, 4 or 5 in number, contained his poetic feeling on the song of our nightingale. The writing was not well legible, and it was difficult to arrange the stanzas on so many scraps. With his assistance I succeeded, and this was his Ode to a Nightingale poem, which has been the delight of everyone. Fantastic story. Charles Brown probably is bigging up slightly his role in the story, but you can see it actually did happen. You can see that kind of a story and see why the house was inspirational for John Keats's poetry. That Ode to the Nightingale, while not written at one go in the garden, was inspired by sitting in that garden, listening to a nightingale, listening to that nightingale, that bird sing. And that's why I think some of his poems are really, really, really inspiring. And why it's good to have a plum tree in John Keats's garden, because you can tell the story and get people thinking and imagining. And that's why Thomas Hardy visited the house, and why he quoted that first line that I quoted at the top of my talk, because Thomas Hardy wrote a poem about Keats' house. Just interesting as well as John Keats wrote a poem about Milton's house, and John Keats wrote a poem about going to see other people's houses. But this is the poem that Thomas Hardy wrote about visiting Keats's house. Imagining John Keats has come back to visit his house 100 years after he died. What streets are stolen up all around, and there's never a nightingale anymore. I'm not going to read the poem. You can read it. There are 3 slides, and you can find it on the internet. You may have a copy of this in your Hardy collected poems. But Thomas Hardy imagines him coming back when not only has Italy and Rome grown up and changed, Spanish steps have certainly changed since Keats's day, but that Hampstead has changed. But do you walk like a ghost through the house and seeing his ancient tree? Now that tree might not be the plum tree. There is a very, very elderly mulberry tree in the front of Keats's garden, and that almost certainly was there in Keats's day, though I'm not sure he wrote an ode to a mulberry tree. And will he be pleased that a laggard few, and I became one of those, would preserve his nook? preserve the place where he was, because the story was shortly after the First World War, Keats House was advertised as a development opportunity. Knock this property down and you can build lots of flats there and other houses. And that's when the great and the good of their day, Thomas Hardy among them, helped to save Keats House for the nation. And it opened as a museum in 1925. So it will celebrate its centenary as a museum in a few years' time. But there, he's comparing Keats House in Hampstead and Rome. But then, and I think the last verse is particularly poignant and important, that Hardy envisages Keats appreciating the house more than the Spanish Steps. This house, this is not a game between those of us who run Keats House in London, those of us who run the Keats Shelley House in Rome, but actually where more of him remains, where he's not tuneless or cold, that actually you can be inspired by John Keats. You can read his poems in the garden. You can see where inspiration came, and you can read those poems. And so that, I think, is my connection with John Keats, my connection with his poetry, his house, and other people's poetry as well. Now, I know this is going to be put on YouTube, so my last slide is where you can find out more. When the house reopens, you'll almost certainly have to book to go there, but it's an amazing place. Do go if you can. You can walk up the road past it anywhere, anytime. But these are some of those links, particularly the first one, because the Keats Bicentenary is in full swing. Keats House in London has handed over the story for a few months to the Keats Shelley House in Rome, because now, 200 years ago, John Keats would have been in Rome in January 1821. But there's a lot more there about his story, about his life, about the books you can read about him as well, about what they're doing. So if you fancy, go to Twitter, go to Instagram. There's a lot more there than I can tell you, and more what's been happening in the last 8 or so years since I've been, directly looking after Keats House. So hopefully that's been of interest, a few things you may not have come across before. And as always, I will try and answer some of your questions if I can. Thank you for bearing with me. Over to you, Neil, or anybody else. I'll stop sharing my screen now. And over to you, Angela, as well.
Yes. Thank you very much, Geoff. It's always amazing how much information you manage to pack in to your talks, how much better informed we are at the end of them. So that was a brilliant tapestry of John Keats' life, so tragic, and also a wonderful introduction to the house for anybody who's not been there. On a couple of the chats, people are saying how they're looking forward to going once it's opened again. And it seems as if we really have to go to the London Region talk on the 8th of March in order to pick up on another aspect of it given by you, Keats's poetry. So thank you. I'll hand over now to questions. Neil, I think you have the whole screen, so would you like to see if you can manage?
Yes, if anybody has got any questions, they can either put it on chat and then I will remove the sound from them, or they can wave to me and I'll take them out. So if anybody's got, it's across 4 screens, so if you could wave quite violently.
I'm only getting 4 people.
Is that Sandra, are you waving? No. I can see Simon. Okay, I'll ask Simon to unmute.
Yes.
Yes, you're on now.
Thank you, Geoff. That was fascinating. I'm very interested in that relationship between Mr. Brown and Fanny Brawne and Keats. How much of a muse do you think Fanny Brawne actually was to Keats? And if he was a muse, she was a muse for him, why did Brown so much object to her?
I think that Brown started off from a protected position before Fanny Brawne ever featured, if you like. So I think, you know, Keats had been developing his intellectual poetic life at the same time that he was still continuing his medical studies. And I think it was his friends on the poetic side, if you like, Charles Brown, one of them, Brown, one of them, who they felt that he could become a really, really important poet and wanted to protect him from everything that might stop him doing that. So Fanny Brawne became, if you like, the most apparent part, but clearly as somebody that Keats was in love with, that could do that. And I think because Fanny was much younger, I think they saw her wasn't an intellectual within their group. They looked down on her and saw her as not somebody who could add to John Keats's intellectual life. Personally, I think that's not, whether she was less intellectual is not the point. I think she still continued to inspire him.
Yeah.
And I think it's fairly safe that Bright Star was inspired by her. And that, I would see, stands as one of his most important poems. So I can understand why Brown started the way he went. But I can equally see that wasn't really, you know, I don't agree with him in what he did.
Thanks.
I will say it's actually something that does come out through the film as well. That sort of challenge between the two that is part of the story that does come out very strongly.
Anybody else like to wave to me?
I can't see anybody now, Neil, so it's definitely over to you.
I can see John Turpin. Okay. John, if you'd like to unmute, please.
Okay, am I through?
Yes.
Yeah. Join with the others to thank Geoff for a brilliant survey of the man and his times and his home. You just squeezed in a mention of Shelley at the end, Geoff.
Yes.
In the context of the Rome house. And certainly Shelley was a great champion of Keats after he died. And Shelley wished his remains, his mortal remains, were buried in the same cemetery in Rome as Keats. That was Shelley's wish. And he was also much admired by Tennyson. So he wasn't just slightly famous. He was admired by fellow poets, and that's something which would have meant so much to him, I think, had he lived on. And one more, if I may make one more comment while I'm on, that here in South London we have a couple of, as it were, Cockney poets. You could call them Cockney poets. We've got our Robert Browning from Walworth, and also William Blake from Lambeth, down near the river. Sadly, neither of those left a dwelling house to visit, although the Robert Browning home on the Camberwell-Walworth borders was there until, well, the mid-19th century at least. It's a shame it ever went, but he's remembered in a school and a street and one or two other ways. But Geoff, thank you so much.
No, not at all, John. And it's really good to point out some of those poets who did admire him. You're quite right. Shelley very much admired him, and yeah, Danaeus it's a wonderful poem. If you read some of because there are two fairly recent, they're not very recent biographies who take slightly different views. That actually Shelley's view, influenced the general view of John Keats actually up to the time of Tennyson, and it was when almost Tennyson became the next poet who took John Keats on and sort of made him slightly less of the failing tuberculosis, sort of ridden poet that Shelley had almost seen him as. But no, I completely. Shelley did. And what I find also interesting is that those modern poets, Benjamin Zephaniah, John Headley, they've really been inspired by John Keats as well. It's not just, dead white 19th century poet or whatever. They've taken him. I have to say, John Headley, who is a very left field poet, if you like, has run some fantastic poems about John Keats having that fight with celery, if you like, just taken that idea and taken it a bit further. And yes, I agree about houses, because it could easily have been that Keats' house had been bulldozed,
Yeah.
Because after Eliza Chester, from about 1850 to the First World War, it simply became a rental property. And lots and lots of people just lived in Keats' house. And I believe, I'd have to prove this, I've just remembered it, that Deborah Mogach, the writer, I believe was actually born either in or near Keats' house, because I'm sure I've heard her speak and say she can remember when it was simply somewhere to rent and no one really remembered John Keats. So yes, fully agree with you.
Mm.
Any more questions, comments?
I think Pamela Rubin wants to say something.
Right.
No, I just wanted to say how much, when one is in Rome on the Spanish Steps, how deeply one feels Keats' presence. It is a very extraordinary thing, and his house there, that is it's very nice. I felt it very deeply. I wonder whether in some ways Keats' house, because it's been restored as a Victorian house, whether that hasn't lost a little bit.
I should say, I'm glad we've got a cat, because Keats loved cats.
I'm sorry.
But actually, no. I should have explained. I only focused on one room. It's only the room that Eliza Chester added that has been decorated in a Victorian manner. All the others are decorated in a Georgian manner, and we took a lot of advice on that, and we actually got somebody in to advise on Georgian wallpaper of the day and Georgian paint of the day, and also the style of house, because that house was built as a speculative making money, nice suburban villa. And if you like, what kind of wallpaper would it have had? So it wasn't necessarily, sort of cutting edge, but it wasn't down at heel. So no, be reassured, the rest of the house is very much in the style that John Keats would have remembered. And I have to say, your cat has reminded me, there were too many quotes, but actually, in another of his letters, John Keats writes about the fact that his next door neighbours, the Brawns, there's a mother and a child cat, a kitten, and he's a bit upset that it's only the mother that visited him, and he's wondering whether he's not suitable for kittens. So again, I find the letters fascinating because, if you like, there's a human being around the poetry. A man who got cross and angry, a man who fought people with celery and played music and went and played on Hampstead Heath as well. And this is not, I'm afraid, my leaps of connections. Going back to poets and poetry and Hampstead Heath, there's an absolutely famous time when John Keats meets Samuel Taylor Coleridge on Hampstead Heath. Now, if you know anything about Coleridge, Coleridge could talk the hind leg off a donkey, and he'd just talk about millions of things all at once. And they met on Hampstead Heath, and both poets write about it later on. And Samuel Taylor Coleridge writes about it, saying, I happened to bump into John Keats on, Hampstead Heath. We spoke for a few minutes and then we walked on. John Keats remembers it differently and says, I bumped into Coleridge. He talked to me for about an hour and then we walked on. And I think it says a lot about both poets, not to Coleridge's detriment, because Coleridge's was just totally different and amazing. But another occasion, as John Turpin said, where poets met each other and respected each other. Anyway, I'm sorry, I lumped all that on your one point. But yeah, thank you for asking about the decoration, because that was an important point I didn't make. And I should say, now you can all see me, I'm not sure you could. This is the love letter, by the way. It's that big. This is a reproduction, I have to say. But I will say, I had to look at the original today because our auditors were auditing the Keats House charity and wanted to know that the letter was in safekeeping. So I had to go and look at it in the strong room, take a picture of it and validate it that it was still in safe custody and not in my top pocket. Anyway, thank you for the question, Pamela.
I think Pamela wants to say something again. Pamela?
I believe that they did a post-mortem on Keats, I believe, and they said they couldn't understand how he was still alive. His lungs were so damaged.
Yes, I can imagine that. Yes. Sorry, no, I was just reading the chat, the links. Yeah, I agree. And the thing is, as I said in my talk, he knew that. He knew how unwell he was. He was, yeah. There's you'll know Andrew Motion, the former Poet Laureate, who wrote a biography of John Keats. He also wrote a little novel on the premise that John Keats actually lived, gave up writing poetry, and became a country GP. It's, if you can catch it, it's worth a read. It's a nice little what if you like.
A comment come up from Robert. I can't see a second name.
Holden.
Yes, yes.
Robert. Can we unmute? Can you unmute, Robert? Make your comment.
Yes, just to say that, of course, when we see the name Severn, we link it with John Ruskin. And John Ruskin, in the later years of his life, was more or less looked after by the Sevens. They saw him, they went with him when he moved to Brantwood in the Lake District, and they were really responsible for the distribution of his assets, and didn't do it entirely well as we would have wished, because obviously most of us would have wished that Ruskin's art and paintings could have been given to the nation, but that wasn't to be. Yeah. But of course, I've just put on the chat the link between the two, that Joseph Severn, who painted Keats, was the father of our Arthur Severn, who married John Ruskin, and who married Joan Agnew, who is the second cousin to John Ruskin. Thank you.
No, thanks, Robert. And there's just so many connections that spin out from this. And in fact, some of those properties in the Lake District, when I was involved with Keats House, there's an organisation for people who did my kind of job, people who look after historic houses of writers and poets. And that was fascinating too, how we all have different parts of the different stories. And some people have, amazing houses, some people have small properties, and how do you tell those writers' stories? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Good, thank you, and thank you very much.
No, not at all. No.
Thank you. You'll have to post the details of your other talks though for us, so that we have so that we can have access to them.
Well, we've only started. I've done the one I did just before Christmas. I think is available. Sean Neal's. The others have got contacts. The other ones were done 2 or 3 years ago. In fact, my first one was done on Magna Carta. That was 2015. So that's 6 years ago now, and that was before the time. It's before we ever thought of doing Zoom talk. So, you know, I'd have to reprise that one and have it recorded. But the others, yeah.
Presumably the one from London region will be recorded.
I presume so. And that would be great, because it was Liz who came to me with the idea that we should read poetry, and I know we didn't read any poetry today, but actually to do that, but some of the background to some of the poems is really interesting. You know, not just writing ode to a nightingale, in the garden.
Yes, can I say something? Yeah, I thought because it was happening quite soon after this one, we didn't want to repeat exactly the same. So I thought we could, I mean, it's given us some nice links to flesh out a bit, to read some of those bits. I've put the date in the chat. It's on the 8th of March. And indeed, it will be recorded. All the London region talks, which are on a Monday evening at 5 o'clock, are all archived for a limited period of time on the London region website. And David's put the link up there near the beginning of the chats. Thank you.
Robert has got his hand up.
Robert, can you unmute? Can you unmute yourself, Robert?
What is actually planned for the 23rd of February, do you think?
I don't know. I know that if we had not been in lockdown, there would have been actual events at the house, and both the house in London and the house in Rome. The top link, and I'll see if we can put that on the chat, or certainly on the recording, keeps everyone up to date. So there will be things virtually happening, but obviously I suspect we're going to be probably in still full lockdown by that time. So it's unlikely there will be things taking place at the house. But I'll keep in touch. I have a lovely colleague who runs Keats House, who amazingly rejoices in the name of Rob Shakespeare. And I'll find out from Rob if there are other things going on that I can send on, maybe to some of you on the committee, and they can be posted through through Dulwich District, so you can see what's going on. So I'll see what I can do to keep you up to date on that.
Okay,
I think you should all undertake to read one Keats poem to yourself on the 23rd of February, whatever it is.
Yes. Or else stand on your front porch, in front of your house or your flat, and just declaim it to the world.
You could do that too.
Yes, okay. The last question, which you could spend an hour answering, is: do you sometimes think what would have happened had Keats lived?
Yes, and it's a bit, what would he have done? I'm not sure he would have become a GP. You know, he was a poet. He would, you know, if he'd not gone to Rome and not got ill, I suspect he would have developed a better reputation. In other words, not amongst his fellow poets, but I suspect his poetry would have become better appreciated, if you like. And he probably therefore would have become more successful, because it's certainly the case that the financial situation, those lawsuits that dogged him through his life, were resolved, and some money did become available. So I suspect he would have become slightly more financially secure. What he did, I mean, to be honest, you can only look, you know, a few years ahead, probably to his 30s. But who knows? Who knows that Wordsworth became what he became in 1850 from that young poet in the midst of the French Revolution. I doubt if he'd have gone down Wordsworth's route, because I don't think he was that way. He wasn't political, if you like. But I think he would have produced more poetry, and very good poetry, because he was producing some of his best poetry just at the time when he got ill and eventually died. So I can't see that stopping, if you like.
Thank you very much.
Not at all.